All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us at Venture Cafe for another artist studio tour. My name is Angela McQuillan, and I'm the curator at the Esther Klein Gallery at the Science Center in Philadelphia, which is also home to Venture Cafe. And tonight we're going to get to look inside the studio of Philadelphia-based artist Lewis Colburn. Lewis creates sculpture and installation that questions how we reconstruct and retell narratives that become our histories. Lewis's work has been shown throughout the United States at venues including the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, Hallwall's Contemporary Art Center, the Pittsburgh Center for the Arts, and the School 33 Art Center in Baltimore. His work has also been featured in Sculpture magazine. Lewis holds a BA in studio art and Russian language from St. Olaf College and an MFA in sculpture from Syracuse University. He's participated in residency programs at the Center for Land Use Interpretation, the Vermont Studio Center, and Sculpture Space and Declinic Studios in Hungary. So everyone, please welcome Lewis Colburn. Hey, Lewis, how are you?
Hi. Can I get started?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm gonna just dive in. So thank you all for being here. Just to give you kind of a quick sketch of what I'm gonna do today. So I'm gonna do this sort of as a studio visit or studio tour, but I'm actually not physically at my studio because I don't have sort of quality internet there. So what I've done to start the talk is take a series of photos of the studio space that I work in. And there are some works that are sort of in progress and recently finished there. And then I've got a series of images of other works that are recent that I'll share and talk about a little bit. As I was saying to Angela before we got started, if you do have questions, feel free to just drop them in the chat, I think, and I'll answer them as we go. I'm not going to do this as a sort of very formal artist talk. I think Angela sort of envisions these things a little bit more like an informal dialogue. So I'll just kind of dive in. What I'll do, I'm going to start by sharing my screen to share the PowerPoint here. So let me just click through this really quickly and get that started. So let's see here, share screen, desktop, share. And okay, so that should give you, is everyone okay to see the PowerPoint on the screen? Okay, perfect. Great,
Yeah,
thank you.
that looks good.
Wonderful. So this is the studio space that I share with my wife. We are in a building called Viking Mill in East Kensington in Philadelphia. We've been there for actually about 10 years. I think at this point we're the longest term tenants in the building, so we're lucky to be there. And the studio space, as you can see it, is kind of a multi-purpose, but probably geared primarily towards woodworking. And then to be very clear, I teach sculpture and 3D design at Drexel University here in Philadelphia, and Drexel has all these sort of fancy digital fabrication tools that I use a lot in making my work. So all the fancy high-tech stuff is at Drexel. The more sort of manual woodworking stuff and fabrication and assembly happens at my studio over in East Kensington. So a little bit later on, I'll just show you a few process images of how I work with that technology at Drexel. But the studio is kind of where a lot of the actual sort of figuring out and making happens. So, as you're looking at it, table saw, various woodworking tools. I'm gonna go on to my next slide, so long as PowerPoint lets me do so.
It looks pretty organized, I have to say.
People say that, but it's, well, I will say, okay, one of my pandemic projects was a studio deep clean that hadn't happened in something like 9 years. So I got rid of a lot of things. It's much less chaotic than it was. I will say it's extremely dusty all the time there because it's a wood shop, and I try to have dust collection and keep things kind of manageable. But one of the things I'm working on right now is renovating the third floor of our house, so that can be clean space for like sewing and computer processes and stuff, because right now the studio is just a dust bomb. So this is the studio space. We did sort of set up these clean walls so we can photograph artworks, and it's also kind of a place for me to look at things and think about them as they are in progress. The thing you'll see, this sort of mass of denim is actually a piece I'll be showing you in just a minute here that I recently finished. Um, let's see here, going on to the next slide. Looking back, so sort of a large work table, a few more woodworking tools. You know, it really all is just sort of storage and organization for the various things that I do there. You'll see also in the lower right of this image, my dog Roxy often helps me in the studio, or at least sleeps on the floor while I make lots of loud noise and gets sort of resentful if I'm too loud. But you know, tool storage, all that other stuff. So we're both, you know, woodworkers at heart. So this is kind of a place where a lot of things get stashed and stored. And then this is my workbench, which is also the virtual background that I'm using right now. I don't really work at it so much as just sort of store things that are in progress. And then up at the top, there's this sort of shelf of objects that I've made, but are probably, they didn't work for their intended role in a piece. And so they are stored and maybe will get repurposed another day. You know, it's kind of like too good to throw away, but not good enough to actually use in an artwork. You know, and then just other kind of things that I accumulate and gather, right? So what I'm going to do, the next few pieces, I'm going to talk about several pieces here, and I will say, I'm going to ask you to sort of bear with me because these are new works that I produced basically, you know, during the first two were sort of during the pandemic moment, and one of the things that's really sort of changed about how I work is, you know, I've been fortunate over the last few years to be very active exhibiting work throughout the United States and having a lot of sort of places to sort of go, and maybe a context where I'm making work in response to a certain event or site or location, or say an artist residency. And then of course the pandemic sort of means that that is not happening anymore, right? I mean, I'm not really going anywhere. I'm not exhibiting work actively, which is, you know, which is all sort of well and good, and it's nothing to complain about at all, but it means that the work is sort of turned more sort of internally towards things I'm working on in the studio, things I'm thinking about from what I'm seeing in the world. A lot of the work previously is very much about sort of how we construct historical narratives, right? So creating a replica of an object, and I'll show you some older pieces later on in the talk, and thinking about how creating the replica sort of changes its meaning and maybe blurs its history or the narratives that it helps to create. Whereas the things I'm making now are sort of, they're both sort of more tightly inward looking in terms of, you know, things I'm gathering from the neighborhood as I walk around, and inspiration I'm sort of seeing as I move through the city, say walking the dog, and then also sort of digesting this very unique and kind of dystopian moment that we find ourselves in this sort of situation of you know, pandemic and whatnot. So let's see here. This is the sort of good photograph of the piece that you saw initially in the middle of the space. And this is one of the newest, this is the newest thing I've made, I should say. And it's called A Burden, Temporarily Embarrassed Any Day Now. I guess I do tend to go for like long titles, but this thing, rather than just sort of, I'm just gonna sort of give you a sense of how this developed, as opposed to sort of trying to weave it into a particular process that I work with, because this one's sort of an oddball that I still feel kind of good about though. So one of the things I've been doing during the pandemic is taking sort of very long bike rides, right? That's a nice thing to, you know, do that's easily socially distant. So I go out from my neighborhood to the Schuylkill River Trail. And as I'm going through North Philadelphia one day, I passed a van that had this really, this graphic on it that caught my eye. And it was a person in silhouette standing and sort of pulling what looks like a radio flyer wagon, right? You know, the sort of iconic red wagon with two wheels that for children. But then in the wagon is this sort of polygonal boulder, right? This big rock. And then on the rock, there's sort of tagged, you know, my struggles, and it says things like, you know, homelessness and addiction and stuff like that. And it's a graphic for an organization called One Day at a Time that is focused on working with people experiencing homelessness and addiction, and, you know, sort of serving a community in North Philadelphia. But the graphic really struck me as this sort of incredible, vivid illustration of you know, this sort of psychic, physical, and societal burden that people are struggling under, and that has been really exacerbated by the current moment that we find ourselves in, right, with mass unemployment and things like that. So this piece gestated from starting to make this sort of this boulder form that's on the back of it, and thinking about that as this sort of weight, right, this sort of massive encumbrance, like a debt, right, or all the sort of societal pressures that we sort of feel in this particular moment. It's plywood just sort of pieced together and then bondoed over to make this sort of rock surface. And then everything else is sort of, a lot of it's also sort of found from the neighborhood. So this lovely kind of iron railing is, where I live in Philadelphia and East Kensington is really rapidly gentrifying. And so there's a lot of construction that happens, and as well as demolition. And so if I'm out walking the dog and I see something, I tend to grab it. And so this was this lovely cast iron railing I located. And then this sort of mass, to my mind, is sort of thinking about like this, this person sort of down on the luck, but being sort of forced forward by, the economic pressures that people face, needing to sort of house and feed ourselves, and thinking about the sort of cruelty of the way that our society tends to not address those needs, right? It makes it very difficult for people to access the support and aid that they need when they are placed in a difficult situation. So this sort of denim mass is all sewn from old jeans that, and primarily they're the legs of jeans that I've cut off and turned into cutoff shorts over the years, but I kept all the legs just because I'm a pack rat and don't like to get rid of material. So it sort of turned into this sort of progressively sewed and distressed and patched thing. And then the boot is actually one of my wife's old work boots. And then the piece has a few other elements, though, that are kind of important to see here. And so this is that sort of figural mass. It's got this little brass stamped sign that says "Any Day Now" on it, which struck me as this sort of, it's a word of hope, but it's also sort of the title, "Temporarily Embarrassed," right? I mean, that's one of those quotes that sort of has circulated so much that it's hard to identify its original provenance, but one sort of starting point from it, I believe it's John Steinbeck writing that socialism never took root in America because we all view ourselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires, right? So we see ourselves as like individuals whose circumstances are gonna change, right? When we make it big, or when we get that that next job or something like that, right? Where, as opposed to sort of working collectively to try to make circumstances better for the vast bulk of population, as opposed to the tiny percent who's already doing all right. So that's where that title comes from. It kind of again, it's one of those quotes that's been the actual thrust of it is kind of arguable, but I think it's sort of out in the ether at this point. And then the other element to me that was kind of important, it probably is a little bit hard to read here, but one other bizarre pandemic occurrence for me was I got a mailing from the Department of Labor and Industry in Pennsylvania saying you've been approved for unemployment benefits. I said, fortunately, I've not lost my job, so someone has stolen my identity and applied for unemployment under it. And so, I went through the rigmarole, sort of, giving evidence to the state about this. But then I was left with this card that has my name on it, and it's a fraudulent unemployment benefits card. And I thought, well, that really that's an iconic, bit of this moment. So it became this little detail in the piece that I think really becomes kind of important going forward. And then, this is the side view of it, right? This is a little kind of carved basswood hand with the trumpet sort of, I think about that as sort of like a symbol of like authority or economic pressure sort of prodding someone forward, right? So this thing becomes a little bit more kind of metaphoric in some ways. Okay, so that's the newest one. And again, these are all new to me, so I'm sort of talking about them in public for the first time. So bear with me if I'm a little bit verbose here and there or inarticulate. So this next piece was probably the first one that I made during the pandemic shutdown. It's called "There Are No Miracles Here," Laocoon / flamethrower. And so let's see here. So the Laocoon is this sort of iconic ancient Greek sculpture that depicts this this sort of bearded father figure, Laocoon, attempting to protect himself and his sons from these two serpents that are attempting to pull them into the ocean. It comes from the Aeneid in Virgil's Aeneid. Sorry, I didn't read up on it entirely, but as a sculpture, it's really iconic, right? It's sort of instantly recognizable. This sort of highly torqued, dynamic torso, twisted with effort, and so. This thing initially started off as kind of a wall piece, and the last thing I did while I had access to the digital tools at Drexel was to carve a foam mold that would allow me to cast that torso, right? So one of the things that I find really fortunate as a maker of sculpture is that so many historical sculptures have been 3D scanned and are just freely available online as mesh models that you can download. And so to me, that's like, wow, there's this whole virtual cast hall of sculptures that I can just download and tinker with, right? And you cut them apart and you can then bring them back into the real world via digital fabrication tools like a CNC router, right? So to make this, I actually carved a negative mold out of insulation foam, and the torso is cast in thin plaster, right? It's just a shell. You'll see the back of it. But the piece kind of started off from that, and it's this incredibly sort of like fit and dynamic and energetic torso, and then behind it is this sort of flaccid red union suit, right? Like a sort of all red, like the sort of the type of garment that you would wear underneath your clothing, and maybe not take off all winter if you're in, a northern climate, for example. And so thinking about the contrast between this sort of like, shapeless mass up here and then this sort of highly dynamic torso. And then from there, a few other things that kind of took root in this piece as I moved around trying to figure out other elements. So the title of the piece, the flamethrower reference, actually comes from this really iconic image that came from the 2017 Charlottesville Unite the Right rally, right? So there's this astonishing image of a group of these sort of neo-Nazi or white supremacist fellows who are actually sort of ineffectually waving a Confederate flag, and they all look like they haven't been out in the sun for like 30 years, right? They're like in their combat boots, but they're kind of like a little bit overweight, and they're kind of like awkward as they're moving. And then there's this image, and so they're swinging this giant Confederate flag, and then there's this young black man who's taken a can of hairspray and lit it on fire and sort of is aiming the jet of that flame at these men in order to protect an older white man who was protesting on his side of the event. So it's this incredible image, and then the young man is sort of he's very fit and he's sort of dynamically placed in the space. And I was thinking about that contrast between this sort of like dying reactionary breed, which I hope will just go away, and this sort of much more inclusive and sort of rich and contemporary version of America that I hope we can bring about, right? And so it's this contrast, right? There's this sort of like dynamic torso, and then the sort of flaccid old, I've been living in my basement for many years, red union suit, and so I found a couple of crushed cans of Budweiser in the neighborhood. I kind of thought one night that'd be a nice thing to sort of throw in there, and then I found it the next day out walking around. And then I also gather up construction gloves in my neighborhood because they get discarded because there's so much construction going on, like the sort of dipped gloves. And I find them really wonderful because they sort of imply the body without actually being the body. So I sort of sewed them together into this little dangling element. And again, this is the rear view of the thing, right? So you can see that the torso is entirely hollow in this context. Okay.
So Lewis, you use a lot of hands in your work, and I feel like you always have. What does that represent to you?
What do you mean by handwork? Like
you use a lot of hands, like actual images of or sculptures of hands.
Yeah, it's something that just kind of came about over the last like several years. To me, I think so. The honest answer is I've been doing a lot. I do it with my students at school, where it's really easy to make a mold of a hand with alginate, right? That same stuff that you get your teeth molded with at the dentist, and then cast it in plaster, and it's kind of miraculous, right? Because every detail comes through it, every pore, every little gesture, and so I started doing that, and then it came out of a body of work that was thinking about sort of like museum displays and how a museum might imply how a body might relate to, say, an antiquated tool or piece of equipment without going to the trouble of actually producing an entire body for the diorama. And often that might consist of an arm or a leg or just sort of one component that sort of shows how you relate to these things. It's kind of a way to sort of activate these objects in almost kind of a ghostly fashion. So it came out of that in some ways, but I mean, the funny thing for me is that, you know, so much of sculpture has to do with the body, right? But when I went to school, it was really like figure modeling was totally out of fashion, right? We never touched that with the 10-foot pole, right? No one, and now I really wish I had more of that background. And so the digital tools and these sort of, you know, ways of you know, recreating a small portion of the body are kind of my way of incorporating those skills through sort of a backdoor of my own, right? But we do pay attention, right? We're so hardwired to pay attention to the body. So a hand pointing, you know, that gets your attention, right? It directs your gaze, and it implies that there's part of the, you know, that there's a human agency here in some ways.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So, but this, let me build off of that, because this next piece, I'm going to go into the process of this piece a little bit here. So this is called Dumb Heroic Gestures, and this was early 2020, before the pandemic. And so to break it apart a little bit, I guess, that particular leg is actually 3D scanned from William Rush's sculpture of George Washington in the Second Bank of the United States in Philadelphia, right? So William Rush is this American, like amazing sculptor that I paid a lot of attention to over the years. 18th century, one of the co-founders of the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. He started his career carving ships' figureheads, right? So the sort of wooden figure, you know, under the bowsprit of a ship. And then he sort of segued into sculpture, but he never had a proper classical education. And so if you see these sculptures, they're astounding, but the sense of the figure is kind of off, right? Like the faces tend to be kind of weird. The proportions are a little strange. And the amazing thing about it, materially, he never worked in stone, right? He was never trained to carve stone. So he carved these things out of pine, which he then like puttied and painted white to try to turn into like, you know, an early American version of neoclassical sculpture, which I think is just astonishing as kind of like an evolutionary offshoot of, you know, this narrative of sculpture. So this is his George Washington. I got permission to 3D scan portions of it a few years ago and had the files kind of kicking around. But it is, you know, the leg on top of kind of a rocky outcrop, right? You know, it is this sort of dumb idea of like, you know, dominating the landscape, and, you know, this sort of very kind of 18th, 19th century, you know, idea of, you know, expansion and, you know, kind of bending nature to your will, right? Which I really profoundly disagree with, right? Hence the title of Dumb Heroic Gestures, right? But we see, you know, these sort of puffed up men, you know, in their sort of sculptural memorials. And so here I've just given it the leg. And then this is a rock that I carved digitally. The other elements were all produced manually. I'm going to show you another set of details, and then I'll talk about process on this one, because it'll clarify things, I think, a little bit. So let's see, if we go to the next slide. And again, this is another piece with the gloves and some sort of like, you know, a torn up tarp, right? Part of this vernacular of what I see in the neighborhood. You know, the first few years I was in Philadelphia, I spent a lot of time thinking about the built environment, because it seems very, like, so much of it feels kind of improvised in a way that I wasn't used to, right? Things are sort of superimposed and fixed, you know, temporarily, and then those fixes get fixed, and it turns into the sort of new, you know, a new language that I wasn't entirely familiar with. And so the other element in the piece, you know, is sort of an uprooted bollard, right? If you've ever seen, you know, if a car has hit like a pole, it'll often pull the sort of root of that bollard out of the sidewalk and leave this big chunk of concrete down there. But to give a sense about the process a little bit, so what I do, a lot of the work that I do is done, it's digitally fabricated using a computerized router, right? Which is basically like a robotic carving machine. And it can do, you know, flat patterns, you know, cutting, say, IKEA furniture parts out of a sheet of plywood, or with a little more sort of planning, it can do fully three-dimensional carving, right? And one of the things, I was really fortunate a couple of years ago to get this fourth axis attachment for one of Drexel's CNC routers. So that's effectively a lathe type attachment that fits on the machine, and it can rotate the workpiece while the machine carves it, right? It doesn't spin it, it just sort of incrementally rotates it. But one of the neat things that's let me do is I can just like, grab a chunk of a tree and put it on this thing and carve it into a shape. And I know that, but that just, it's so miraculous that to be able to do that in some ways. Another thing about, the way the neighborhood where I live gets developed, if a new building is being put on a site, they'll cut trees down, obviously, if there are trees, and then they cut them into these nice 2-foot long chunks, and then they get rid of them. But if I can get in there before they get rid of them, a 2-foot long chunk of tree is perfect for carving on the CNC router, right? So I grabbed these things. So this was a chunk of a sycamore that I grabbed a few years ago. And then I made a 3D model of a rock by pulling 3D models of different rocks off the internet and kind of like glomming them together into a new shape. And then this just shows the digital carving process, roughing it out in these sort of step layers, finishing it. And in this case, because this was the tree was green, right? So the wood still wants to move and check or split apart. One of the things I was able to do after I'd roughed it out was to go back in and actually digitally carve out these pockets for what are called butterflies, right? So if you've ever seen like a slab table, like a really high-end, table where it's just a cross section, not a cross section, but sort of a lengthwise section of a tree, those pieces of wood are not very stable because they have a lot of internal tension in them just based on how the tree is grown. And so one of the things that people will do is insert these sort of bow tie or butterfly shaped pieces of wood to prevent those cracks from growing further. So here I kind of took that to this absurd end, sort of playing to my woodworker background, and added all these butterflies in to finish the rock off. The other thing I will say, these pieces have really been kind of growing organically in a way that I hadn't done previously. A lot of the time, I would sort of have a plan for a piece and then be sort of committed to realizing that vision of it because it was going someplace or it was in response to a certain event or certain, exhibition opportunity. But these things kind of have been developing more in the studio. And so, to be very honest with you, I started off, mocking this thing up on top of this sort of strange aluminum structure that I put together. And then I thought, well, that really isn't right, so there's a lot of sort of staring at the thing. And then I'll make digital mock-ups sometimes too, right? So on the right-hand side, this is just a CAD model I produced of it to try to think through how it might operate. So process-wise, I'm really sort of, I use whatever tools I can, right? So that could mean physically assembling things in space. It could mean sketching. It could mean, sketching in video on the computer. These are all tools I use to sort of figure out what these things are going to become, right? But I thought that would be nice to kind of give you a sense of that hybrid process that I tend to work in. And this is another image of it. That's a cinder block that I cast. It's deliberately sort of broken. So it's not a commercial cinder block. It's one that I made. It's one of the things I like to do is sort of blur that line between, what's a product and what I've produced. But everything else.
Cast it out of?
Oh, it's concrete. It's fiberglass reinforced concrete, right?
Okay.
So it's a cinder block made from the material that cinder blocks are made from, but it's my own, and it's on this sort of weird angle and stuff like that. Same with the little A-frame that references the police barricades that you'll see around town. All of that's made, right? I don't have any particular. Ages ago, I had a rule that I had to make everything in all the pieces that I made, but I've long since thrown that out the window. But I do like to be able to blur that line between, what's an artifact, what I've made, what's a found object, because I think that it gives the pieces a kind of richer level of meaning to have that kind of interplay, I feel like. Let's see here. Okay. How are we doing here? So, okay, great. It's about 5 o'clock. This is another piece, kind of a new one. What I'm going to do, I'm going to show you this piece, and then I'm going to show 2 older projects. Not terribly old, but they give you a kind of a context, and then maybe open it up if there are questions and things like that. So this is another piece from late 2019 in that kind of assemblage mode. I guess it sort of turned into thinking about, I'm fascinated with practices of museum display, right? Like how these not only the bigger framing of the museum, like what gets preserved and what is not seen as valuable, right? That sort of bigger question. And I think now rightly a lot of museums are really wrangling with those questions of how was this acquired, right? Should it be returned to the people who originally made it, right? How does the museum value objects made from, say, non-European cultures versus how a museum values objects made by European named artists, right? So those practices of display are really fascinating. I love the little kind of brass or metal little stands that get made to hold an object in a certain position, right? Or the idea, kind of like Angela, you asked about the hands, right? It's like solving for a position this object is supposed to be in, right? Or say a fragmentary sculpture, a museum might say put the head on a stand and the arm on a little piece of metal in a way that implies the way the figure was originally organized, but no longer all those parts are missing, right? So let's see. This is a digitally carved skull. This sort of pocket knife that I've had for a long time. This thing here is it's those miserable cotton gloves that museums like to make you wear to handle things, and I feel like maybe now those are going away, and now we have nitrile rubber gloves and things like that that are easier. But whoever designed those things, I feel like they never looked at a human hand, right? Because those gloves are made with fingers that are half the length of a hand, and but the package of gloves that I had at my studio was described as lintless gloves as opposed to lint-free. I think it's the same thing, but it just struck me as kind of a more poetic term. And then the detail is, this is an old slide that I found. Someone, a couple years ago got rid of all their slides at Drexel, and so I went and rummaged through them. And this is a slide of an Isamu Noguchi sculpture that I liked quite a bit. And the title is sort of my rip-off of, or sort of my misappropriation of the Bob Dylan lyric, from Visions of Johanna, right? Inside the museum's infinity goes up on trial, but eternity, I thought of it as eternity initially, and I liked it better, so I ran with it, right? Okay, so some other things. I'm going to show you a couple more pieces that are a little bit older and kind of might illustrate an approach that's less sort of I'm going to make stuff with what I've got in my studio and stay in that really tight realm. This is a piece that I made for a show out at Penn State Abington in 2019. And it's called The Best of All Possible Worlds. And so this was something I was really lucky to get a grant through Drexel to help make this work. So it's flashier than a lot of the other stuff that I've been making because I had some resources to put behind it. But the sculpture is the Apollo Belvedere, right, which is an iconic piece of classical sculpture that has kind of an interesting and problematic history, right? Because in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was used as an example of white male beauty and the sort of scientific racism of that time period, right? So there was all this sort of horrible pseudoscience about, the angle of the face, indicating sort of, level of development of the person. And so, but they used this Greek sculpture, which was supposed to depict a deity, not an actual human being, as an exemplar of, what ideal white male beauty should look like. But it's got this kind of problematic history, right? And I was able to, this is, entirely digitally carved based on a 3D scan that the State Art Museum in Denmark made available online. And so, thinking about ideas of that kind of problematic abstract ideal as something that we sort of aspire to, but sort of poisons a lot of our dealings with the actual world. And so the other things in the piece, the other elements that are recreated are other artworks that I think kind of participate in that that language of making a kind of abstract ideal that may or may not be helpful as we navigate the world. So the brass elements are replicas of Walter D. Maria's Broken Kilometer, which is this beautiful iconic sculpture that's up in New York at the Dia Art Foundation. It's a kilometer's worth of 2-inch diameter brass rods. I love it, but it's one of those it exists better in your mind almost than it does in person. And then you can see these are replicas of Marcel Duchamp's 3 standard stoppages, right? Really sort of iconic absurd measuring device. And then this detail here is actually a replica of the International Prototype Standard meter bar, which is an object that was supposed to be the reference for all meter-long measures before it was defined, before the meter was defined, you know, in terms of the vibrations of a cesium atom or some sort of mathematical form. So all these kind of, you know, abstract ideals. And then the other objects are casts of trash that I found in my neighborhood, right? So this is this sort of mountain of, you know, discarded shoes and crushed soda cans and coffee cups and just debris, right? So like, you know, what are these sort of like problematic abstract ideals that, you know, we use to navigate the world versus like, here we live in this messy, broken, complicated place that would probably be better if we actually inhabited it and tried to make it better, right? You know, and you know, here's more of these little castings. And again, it goes back to that language of museum display, right? All these little kinds of, you know, aluminum adjustable widgets that hold things in specific places, right? Okay, and then the last thing I'm going to show you is this is probably something that I think about kind of more how I usually work, but this is a piece that I made for, so in 2015, the Glenford in the Delaware, which is a historic house in Northeast Philadelphia, launched an artist in residence program. And I applied to take part in the residence program and was one of the first couple of artists who were selected. And the work I proposed was capturing 3D scans of the really elaborate sort of molding and decorative elements in the house and recreating them to make a series of sculptures that kind of played with both the history of the site and, again, that language of kind of museum display and sort of how narratives are constructed from what we have, right? So the house was originally built in the 1840s. It was it was overhauled and expanded in the early, late 19th, early 20th century. And the forderers who did the expansion actually made their money in kid gloves, right, or kid leather. So they had a huge plant in the Frankfurt section of Philadelphia that made kid leather gloves and shoes, right? And so that was how they made their fortune, right? So this piece is a recreation, again, digitally carved, of one of the really elaborate pieces of molding in the upstairs art gallery space. You'll see the actual thing I scanned in the next slide. But here it is kind of suspended, you know, almost as if it were falling, right? Like it were the only fragment left behind if we'd lost the house as a whole. And then, again, you can see those cartouches up here. This piece was, you know, displayed in the art gallery. And to me, like, it was incredible to have the opportunity to put work in this astonishing, ornate space and then sort of think about its history a little bit too. This piece is called The Story as We Know It, and it's a recreation of one of the columns in the space, right? So I 3D scanned and recreated the finial of the column. But the other wonderful thing about Glenford is kind of like I mentioned at the start of, you know, that shelf above my head here of objects that are, you know, too good to throw away, but not quite good enough to turn into a part of the piece. Glenford has a bunch of stuff that's like that, right? Like furniture from their, you know, from the time when the forderers lived in the house that hasn't been kept up. It's in this kind of unheated carriage house space, but they can't get rid of it, but they don't want to properly accession it either, because that makes them sort of more responsible for its upkeep in a certain way. And so one of the things they let me do was actually use some of those in the sculptures, right? So this base here is actually, if you can imagine it, this was a traveling display case that the forderers used to bring their kid leather products to fairs and trade shows to display them, right? So this object is sort of physically embedded in the history of this house, right? It's how the forderers accumulated the capital that allowed them to, you know, live at this hugely ornate, you know, palatial space at the expense of all the, you know, low-wage workers who are doing really like vile, awful work with, you know, nasty chemicals tanning, you know, goat skin leather in Frankfurt, right? So, you know, thinking about those histories, right? But that object sort of participated in that accumulation of wealth in some ways. And then this last piece, this goes back to the question that Angela asked. This is called An Evening, and there's no 3D scan stuff in here, but the chair is actually one of those objects from Glenn Ford's holdings, not collection necessarily. And then, it's thinking about, this sort of 19th century lifestyle where, someone might be sitting at ease and have this cup of tea brought to them, right? But it's a sort of an exploded view of these figures, right? And the leg and the arm are actually casts of my own leg and arm. And then, the hand is the hand of what's a mold I had from one of my students. But again, thinking about that language of museum display or a diorama, right? How you sort of tell that story and imply the body without actually having, the entirety of a body at, creating that necessarily. Yeah, so that's like a really quick cycle through a bunch of things that I've been making and thinking about and things like that. And I hope that that's like at least an introduction to some of the things I've been doing, but I'd welcome any questions and dialogue at this point.
Yeah, your work is really amazing. Thank you so much. I feel like you're just so skilled in your practice, and it's also so thoughtful. So I really appreciate you taking us on this little tour today. I have a question. When you're making these things out of CNC milled wood, is that like one solid piece of wood, or are these modular things that you're fitting together? And how does that work?
Yeah, well, both is basically the answer, right? So like for this, oh geez, I'm sorry, I just like tripped my computer mouse. For this piece, so I mean, one of the things that I will say, I feel really fortunate. I like developed most of my making skills before I learned the digital tools. And so, for those of you who are, who've been around the Science Center for a little while, I actually worked at NextFab Studio when it was in the Science Center, and that's where I learned how to do a lot of these things, how to work with these digital tools. But for this piece, for example, it's a question of what makes sense to make by hand and what makes sense to make digitally, right? So I'm not an accomplished wood carver in the sense that I couldn't make a convincing carving of this by hand. So, this cartouche was carved as one element. Both of these corbels were carved independently and then assembled. And then these sort of sweep elements were carved digitally, as was the pineapple. But all the rest of it was done, through direct sort of wood fabrication, right? Because it made more sense to build those things versus the effect the machine would give, right? If you look closely at these things, which we can't really do over Zoom, you'll see that the digital stuff, it tends to have kind of softer edges, right? Because it's carved with a bit that has a round end, so you lose information. So making all these dentals that way would not make sense, right? It would not give the same effect. But to go back, let's see here, to the process slide of carving this rock, in this case, it is one big chunk, right? Because now I'm able to sort of deal with those chunks of wood a little bit more usefully with this indexer. Before I had access to that, it would be, and still if I'm doing things of a certain size or shape, it'll be, laminating a bunch of pieces of material together, carving it. It might be a multi-stage process. One of the things that I feel really lucky about is that it can become this kind of dialogue where, say, I'll do some of it manually, I'll carve something, I'll do the next step, on the machine. It goes back and forth, basically.
Mm-hmm. So if anyone has any questions for Lewis, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask them, or you can type them in the chat as well. How do you feel about the way that you use like this digital new technology process to remake historical objects, and how does that like change their meaning to you?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that, the one thing for me is that, let's see here. What's the best way to put this? I mean, like I said before, I kind of approach it pragmatically. I will do, whatever sort of makes the best sense in terms of making this thing. And for a while, I was really sort of involved in this thinking about the digital quality of the objects as a specific sort of shaper of their meaning. Now I think I'm a little more agnostic about it, right? Just because the object has been 3D scanned doesn't necessarily mean that it's a different thing sort of ontologically than it might have been previously. You know, and the one useful lens that I think about, I spent when I was working at MXFab, I thought about this a lot. So if you think about, like, say, video art in the 1970s, right? So video cameras just became available, right? They were wildly expensive, they were complicated, but artists started tinkering with them and, like, pushing their boundaries, right? So, like, you've got, you know, someone pointing a video camera at the sun and burning a hole in the sensor, right? And that's part of the work, right? And in a certain sense, you know, 10 years ago, a lot of the digital tools were sort of approached that way. Like, how hard can I push this thing to, you know, and the fact that it is done digitally is inherently part of the meaning of the work, right? And now I think we're at a point where that doesn't matter so much anymore, right? Because we're more familiar with what the tools can do, and they're all sort of seen as different ways to approach a given end, right? I mean, the funny thing is, I talk a lot about how this stuff is done digitally, but if you talk to, you know, like, I have a friend who works in Jeff Koons's stone shop up in Yardley, PA. That's all done digitally, but then they go back in and you know, carve it manually. I do the same thing, right? I go back in with hand tools and Dremels and stuff. And in a certain sense, it's just sort of how these things are made now, because it doesn't make sense to have someone sit there with a, you know, a chisel and a hammer roughing out the shape when the machine can rough it out quite, you know, close to what you tried to produce. But yeah, I mean, at the same time, conceptually, it's kind of neat that, you know, we're like, you know, in this moment where all these things exist online, right, and are available to us, right? That to me is the thrill, right? You can go to a website like Sketchfab, you know, or Thingiverse, and just download all this stuff, right? The British Museum put all this stuff online, and it is kind of like, you know, that idea of the cast hall, right? If you think about, like, an academic, you know, the sort of academy-based art model that, say, PAFA might adhere to, the tradition of drawing from casts or sculpting in reference to a cast. And they were plaster copies of iconic sculptures that were distributed, you know, all throughout, say, Europe primarily. And now these things exist online, and they're different, but they're, like, just as easy, they're even easier to play with, right? And to me, that's the excitement of those things.
Yeah,
that's kind of a
definitely.
circuitous answer, but
That was great, though. Thank you. So I'm interested in your work as, like, these iconic sculptures and sort of monuments. I know you've done work in the past where you recreated a giant butter sculpture of President Roosevelt. And recently, well, in 2018, you did a piece at Rare of a monument that you then knocked over. How do you kind of feel about monuments? And then right now in this political climate with Black Lives Matter and all of the, you know, people are discarding monuments. How does that make you feel, and how does that relate to your work?
sure. Yeah, I mean, I haven't, you know, first I would say, like, I pay very close attention to all of that. I think that I'm excited that the dialogue is happening. I think it's necessary and long overdue, right? And I mean, my stance is, you know, my personal thought is, like, let's err on the side of, like, you know, there are many people who are saying that these things are painful and harmful, and I think we should believe and honor those voices, first off. I would also say that it's kind of thrilling to see these sort of very stable forms be removed or defaced in some ways. It gives me some hope. At the same time, I also think a lot about what the next step with these objects is, and whether, I'm not entirely certain they need to be necessarily destroyed, but perhaps taken from, you know, everyday public view and placed in a different site where they are carefully, you know, contextualized perhaps. But again, how much more energy do you want to put into those things, right? I mean, the funny thing for me is that a lot of the, particularly Confederate monuments, are really cheap mass-produced things from the early 20th and late 19th century, right? So they're not masterworks of art. They were cast out of zinc because they were cheaper to make that way. They were, you know, mass-produced. You could get one that commemorated the North or the South, you know, just by swapping out a buckle or a hat, right? So they're not necessarily things I want to go to the plate for as sort of like, oh, these are really valuable artworks. No, like, I mean, a lot of these things, like, you know, let's get rid of them, and we can, you know, maybe they become fodder to play with, to undermine, you know, the languages of white supremacy that they were, you know, installed to support. So I think those are some of the things that I think about there. There's a few. The one that I have thought a lot about is there's the piece that was pulled down in 2017 in Durham, North Carolina. It was actually yanked off its pedestal by protesters, and it was a really cheaply made monument, and it just crumpled when it hit the ground. And the video of it's astonishing, but now it's this incredible object that's sort of like twisted and bent. And to me, it's a million times more powerful as this sort of like historical document of this direct action than it ever was, previously. So those are some thoughts about it. But I mean, I don't pretend to have the answers necessarily to these things. I was thrilled to see the Rizzo sculpture just sort of disappear one morning.
Definitely.
I wish that it had been left with the paint job that the protesters put on it, because that was a pretty remarkable piece of like direct intervention,
Yeah, for sure. Does anyone have any questions for Lewis? So I'm wondering.
I do have a question for you.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I've been listening the whole time, and it's fantastic work. I would love to connect. I'm interested in a lot of the same things that you're working on. Was that a PRT, a ShopBot PRT that you retrofitted with the fourth axis, or
no,
like an old one? Yeah.
I don't own one. No, they're Drexels.
Right.
So Drexel has two. They're both PRS Alpha.
Okay.
Yeah, and the fourth axis is on a Deep Z one, to get really into the weeds about these machines. But.
Yeah. No, it's great work. Yeah, I'm impressed. I mean, that's all I'm going to say right now. It's super impressive work, and I love the integration of digital fabrication with these sort of traditional techniques. It's good stuff.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Anyone else? I also want to say I really love your use of like furniture that you're making, and sort of like armature and structure. Like, you were discussing it earlier about how it's kind of emulating like what a museum will show. How do they display objects? Do you create all of those yourself? Like, do you weld all the metal, or is that something that you find or purchase or put together? How does that work?
Mostly I make it because I can't afford to hire people, and some of it's stuff that I can salvage, but another nice little thing I've sort of dipped my toe into is really basic machining processes, like metal machining. I have this little kind of combination lathe mill drill thing at Drexel that like, for example, all these adapters were, I mean, it's literally just like drilling 8 holes, and then tapping them, but they look really flashy and nice, right? Yeah, and I mean, I love doing that, right? I mean, I think, it's funny, like, I mean, I spend a lot of time researching and, thinking about these things and sort of staring at them in the studio, thinking about what the next moves might be. But I mean, the last
Oops.
Okay. The last I've been actually working on renovating my house where I live, like the 3rd floor, and it's sort of like, oh, it just feels really good to be sort of working on this, right? It's sort of like the hands-on process, and so I think that I don't want to lose sight of that, right? It's the same with making all these little armatures and things like that. It's the process of actually engaging with material and figuring out the process is an important element of the work, right? It's not the only thing. It can't be the only thing, but you do have to have some of that component, that's not just sort of like think, stare, right? I mean, I think I love that part of actually making the work. So it means I spend a few 8-hour days, drilling and tapping holes. Well, that's fine, right? That's sort of, pleasurable in its own way.
Yeah.
So,
I also love the piece where the metal beer cans, the Budweiser cans, are displayed on the little rack as well. That's it's funny. It's great.
Yeah, no, that's another thing that's given me great joy lately is like just getting a little like, map gas torch and learning to solder brass to make these little fiddly things, because it is one of those things. It's like framing a drawing, right? Like when you frame like an artwork, it's like, oh wow, this really works. This makes it look really sharp, and then if you take this crappy humble object that like literally trash from the street, and you make this lovely little brass stand for it, it's like, oh wait, there's this sort of inversion, right? Another little thread that I talk about with other people is like that idea of like, what we discard, right, what we throw away, tells the world or future historians much more about who we are and what we value than any sort of narrative we might produce. So maybe, to tie that back to the idea of the Confederate monuments, right? What we throw away, what we remove, what we get rid of, speaks much more to, who we are and what we value than, whatever narrative we are trying to put together and present to the world, perhaps.
Yeah, it's true. So since you're so interested in historical objects and artifacts, do you have any type of like personal collection of objects, or are you a collector?
It's funny that you asked that. I don't. I'm kind of a magpie. But lately I've been trying to pay more attention and gather things, so they tend not to, like, I'm not on eBay like sourcing I don't know, whatever the collection of things might be. I'm kind of an opportunist. I love these. There's a time when I went into this really deep rabbit hole of like researching reenactment and stuff like that. And at a certain point, it got, I don't know, it kind of got out of control, and like it wasn't really it wasn't expressing what I was thinking about. And then now I think, especially in this current moment, like that's really not the language I want to be dealing with, right? Because I think that sort of romanticizes history in a way that we are really trying to, at least I hope, move beyond and unpack and break apart, right? Semantically, I love, the fact that there's a whole catalog of 18th century American, clothing and widgets you can purchase for your reenactment. But the question is, like, well, okay, whose story is being told here? Whose story is being sort of valorized and put forward, right? Who's being erased from this, right? And so, I think that's been, something that I've been thinking more and more about, and sort of moving away from that language a little bit. But I don't know. To say I don't have a collection is probably disingenuous, because I'm a horrible packer. I have a whole house and studio full of stuff, but it doesn't subscribe to anybody's logic about what a collection might be. So.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think we're coming up on 5:30. Thank you so much for coming. This was amazing. I really enjoyed your presentation. We got some compliments in the chat. Also, can you tell us, what's your next thing? I know we're in the middle of a pandemic, but when can people see your work in the future?
Sure. Well, thank you. Thank you again for having me. It's always a pleasure, and I appreciate your giving me a chance to talk about new stuff I don't have language for yet. That's always really nice. At some point in the future, I have a big project that's going to happen at Locust Projects in Miami. But it will probably be early next year, but I don't have a firm date because of the pandemic. Everything's sort of shifting around. Sure. That's going to be a big undertaking. And I have a couple other small things that are in the works, but probably I unfortunately need to keep under wraps for the time being. But this Locust Projects thing is going to be a big undertaking. It's recreating Umberto Baccioni's Unique Forms of Continuity in Space, which is that really dynamic sort of swooping early modernist Italian futurist sculpture, and thinking about the ways that Italian futurism sort of romanticized really awful things like war and violence, and the technological progress at the expense of all these other much more human values. So that's complicated, but it's going to be a fountain with robot arms and a giant recreation of the Baccioni sculpture sometime next year in Florida. So
cool. That sounds great. Well, I put Lewis's website in the chat, so follow him on his website for his next upcoming project.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks everyone. Have a good day.